I laughed the moment my wife fell in the middle of our son's wedding. Not because it was funny, but because I finally understood that everything had reached a point of no return. Eleanor slipped into the tower of glasses, shattering it. My daughter-in-law just stood there, calm, untouched. My son said nothing. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me, waiting for anger. I didn't give it to them. I just looked at the old watch on my wrist and thought, at last the truth had stepped into the light of a ceremony they believed was perfect. Before I go on, if you feel this story is worth listening to, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps me know that somewhere out there are still people willing to sit still and listen all the way through. And now, let me tell you what happened right after that moment. I stayed where I was as the staff rushed in to sweep up the broken glass, as if hiding the mess could somehow restore the perfection they had paid for. The music hesitated, then started again, just a beat slower. Eleanor was helped to her feet. Her hands were shaking more than usual. I stepped forward and placed my hand on my wife's shoulder, feeling the confusion and humiliation she tried to hide behind a weak smile. All eyes were on us. There was curiosity, irritation, and quiet judgment. The Vance family was not used to moments like this. For them, everything had to be clean, controlled, on script. An older woman slipping in the middle of the stage was never part of the plan. Bianca stood a few steps away. She didn't rush. She didn't panic. She simply adjusted her wedding dress, tilted her head toward Caleb, and whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw my son's reaction clearly. Caleb didn't move. He didn't step forward. He didn't help his mother. He just stood there, as if waiting for permission to act. In that moment, I understood a simple contradiction. I had raised a son who was very good at fitting in, and very poor at being a son. Eleanor tried to steady herself. She always did. Her whole life she had learned to keep her balance, even when her hands shook and her heart ached. I looked at my wife, then at Bianca. She smiled, a pullet smile. The kind people use when they believe they stand above you and want a discomfort to end. You should be more careful, Bianca said, loud enough for a few people nearby to hear. No one objected. No one spoke. That silence was not respect. It was a choice. To stand with the stronger side. I felt a laugh rise in my throat. Dry, quiet, but loud enough to make people nearby turn and look. I wasn't laughing because it was funny. I was laughing because the pretending was over. I was laughing because finally they had revealed themselves. Caleb turned to me, his eyes uncertain. Maybe he expected anger. Maybe he was waiting for a reaction he could still fix. In front of his wife's family. I didn't give him that. I walked slowly onto the stage, stood beside Eleanor, and looked straight at the Vance family. That afternoon in Austin, the sun was harsh. The light hit expensive suits and elegant dresses, making everything feel almost unreal. I heard whispers spreading like ripples. Some people recognized me. Others only knew me as the groom's father, the old man in an outdated suit. I raised my wrist and looked at my old watch. It didn't belong in that setting. It never had. I had kept it for years, not for its value, but because it reminded me that time always stands with the truth, no matter how slow. Exactly 6:15, I said calmly, leaving no room for argument. Thank you, Bianca. She frowned clearly, not understanding what I meant. For the first time that day, uncertainty crossed the face she was so used to controlling. You just did something very important. I continued, my voice low and even. You opened a door you should never have touched. No one clapped. No one laughed. Even the music stopped completely. Harrison Vance, Caleb's father-in-law, finally stepped forward. He studied me, weighing what kind of trouble a man like me could cause. Eleanor gently squeezed my hand. I knew she was worried. Not for herself, but for our son. She was always like that, even when she was the one being hurt. I leaned down and quietly told my wife she didn't owe anyone an apology. Then I turned back to the crowd. I didn't need to explain. I didn't need to defend myself. Everything I needed was already in place, at the right time. That wedding to them was a peak. To me, it was only the beginning. An afternoon they believed they were celebrating, without knowing the foundation beneath them had already begun to crack. I stepped off the stage, guiding Eleanor away from the staring eyes. Behind us, the silence lasted longer than any song, and in that silence I knew one thing for certain. From the moment my wife fell, none of them could ever go back to the way things were before. We left the stage area in silence. I didn't look back, not because I feared their stares, but because I no longer had a reason to look. Eleanor walked slowly. Her steps were unsteady, yet she kept her back straight. She was always like that, even when placed in situations that were never meant for her. When we sat down in a quieter corner of the garden, I realized my hands were cold, not from the weather, but because memories had begun to surface. Memories I had locked away for many years, believing I would never need them again. 15 years earlier, I left the inspection service quietly. No farewell party, no speech. I chose it that way. I wanted to see what would happen if I was no longer Samuel Sterling. No thick business cards, no endless phone calls. I wanted to know how my son would look at me when I was just an old man living on a pension, driving an old car, eating dinner at the same time every day. I never told Caleb about the investments. I never told him about the decisions I made back when my mind was still sharp enough to see more than a decade ahead. I let him guess, and he guessed quickly. The calls became less frequent, family meals grew rushed. Then Bianca appeared, bringing with her a world of parties of relationships, measured by how many zeros followed the decimal point. I watched Caleb's eyes change, not because of love, but because of opportunity. Eleanor once asked me if we should tell him the truth. I shook my head. Not to punish him, but to understand. To see what remained in our son's heart when we no longer had anything left to give. The laughter that escaped me on stage earlier was not spontaneous. It was the result of 15 years of silent observation. A server brought towels and water. Eleanor took a small sip. I saw her glance toward the stage where Bianca was being surrounded by false concern. I placed my hand over my wife's lightly trembling hand. I didn't say everything would be fine. I only said that everything was now clear. The old watch was still in my hand. The gift Eleanor had planned was never meant to draw attention. It was just a keepsake. Carefully cleaned, carefully preserved, the way she had always protected the important things in life. But inside it, there was more than they realized. I had anticipated something like this. Not this exact moment, but enough to prepare. In the months before the wedding, I had overheard conversations not meant for me. Harmless-sounding talks about long-term plans, about caring for the elderly, about tidying things up after the wedding. They didn't know I still kept my old habit, never trusting words without proof. The small recording device hidden in the gift was not for revenge. It was a precaution. I wanted to be certain that if one day Eleanor was pushed into a decision she did not choose, I would have enough truth to stop it. When Bianca whispered to Caleb on stage, I didn't need to hear the words clearly. I had heard similar ones before. In quieter rooms where they believed no one was listening. Talk of nursing homes. Of closing up the old house. Of life becoming easier once two old people were no longer in the way. Eleanor didn't know all of this. I never told her. She had carried enough already. But the moment she fell, every boundary I had set was broken. I looked around the garden. People who once nodded politely now avoided my eyes. They didn't know who I was, and that made them uneasy. That unease was the first sign that their control was no longer absolute. Caleb finally walked toward us. His steps were slow, hesitant. He bent down and asked Eleanor if she was all right, his voice low and rushed. I heard fear in it, not concern. Fear that things were slipping beyond his control. "Why did you do that, Dad?" he asked me without looking up. I didn't answer right away. I looked at my son, the boy I once held in my arms, the one I taught how to tie his shoes. I saw a stranger standing in front of me. "I didn't do anything," I said. "I just stopped hiding." Caleb fell silent. He didn't ask another question. Maybe he was beginning to understand. Or maybe he was afraid of understanding too much. I knew that from that moment on, everything had shifted. The mask of the poor father was no longer necessary. Not because I wanted to reveal it, but because they had torn it off themselves. The afternoon wind moved through the garden, carrying the scent of flowers and unease. I sat there beside Eleanor, feeling each of her breaths. Inside my mind, an old plan was quietly activating step by step, unhurried. They thought I was just an old man laughing out of place at a lavish wedding. What they didn't know was that for 15 years I had been patiently waiting for the right moment for the truth to speak on its own, and that moment had just begun. Caleb walked away after that answer, leaving a strange emptiness between us. I watched my son's back disappear into the sea of tailored suits and smiles that were beginning to twist. Eleanor leaned back against the chair, her eyes tired yet still scanning the space, as if she feared that looking away for even a second might let everything slide further out of control. I knew I couldn't stretch this moment for too long. Some truths, once exposed, will find their own way out, no matter how hard people try to contain them. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out a thin stack of papers neatly clipped together. I had carried it through the entire ceremony, not as a weapon, but as a reminder that I was not allowed to hesitate. Eleanor saw it and frowned slightly. She didn't ask. She always trusted that I knew what I was doing, even when it worried her. I stood up. I didn't need a stage. Just enough space for curiosity to settle, and it settled quickly. The silence returned. This time, not awkward, but heavy. I don't intend to speak for long, I began, my voice steady as always. But there are a few things that need to be put in their proper place. Harrison Vance stepped forward one pace. He gave a thin smile, the kind used by men who are used to solving problems with money. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "today is a happy day for the kids." "I know," I replied. "That's exactly why I chose today." I didn't look at him for long. I opened the papers, not to read them, only to let everyone see that they existed. 15 years ago, I said, I left a line of work that many people here have probably only heard about by name. I was used to numbers that didn't sit still, to contracts written in ink that hid far more than they showed. Whispers began to spread. Faces that had once looked confident now turned cautious. For the past 3 years, I continued, I've been rereading what others chose to overlook. Not out of curiosity, but because someone had been using the Sterling name as a guarantee without asking me a single word. Harrison Vance stopped smiling. He straightened his hands clasped together. Bianca turned toward her father, and for the first time I saw real worry in her eyes. The Vance Group, I said slowly, is not as strong as it appears. Overlapping loans, projects revalued again and again, commitments signed behind closed doors. All of it has one thing in common. It needs a name clean enough to stand in front. That was when Caleb came back. He stopped a few steps away, his face drained of color. I didn't look at my son, but I knew he was listening to every word. There is an agreement, I went on, signed not long before this wedding. An agreement in which my son agreed to share internal information from a company I once advised, in exchange for a symbolic seat on a board. No one spoke. No one objected. This silence wasn't courtesy. It was fear. Eleanor took a quiet breath. I felt her hand trembling more strongly now. I turned to her, then to Caleb. This time, I looked him straight in the eyes. I'm not asking you why, I said. I just want you to understand this. Some prices are never written into contracts. Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't deny it. His silence was the clearest answer of all. Bianca stepped forward, her voice higher than before. You're making this up, she said, but her eyes betrayed her. I don't need you to believe me, I replied. I only need you to know that everything you're standing on today was built on unstable ground. I slipped the papers back into my jacket. I didn't hand them out. I didn't need to. Those who understood already did. Those who still doubted would soon have their answers another way. Eleanor stood up slowly. She looked at Caleb, her eyes not angry, only sad. I didn't raise you like this, she said softly but clearly. It was the only thing she said, and it weighed more than any accusation. Caleb lowered his head. Bianca stepped back as if realizing for the first time that she was no longer standing on solid ground. Harrison Vance said nothing more. He understood better than anyone. When a man like me speaks of putting things in their place, doors have already begun to close. I helped Eleanor sit back down. I didn't need to say anything else. What needed to be exposed had been exposed, not to humiliate anyone, but to end a game that had gone on for far too long. The music did not return. From that moment on, the wedding was no longer a ceremony, but a waiting room, waiting to see what would collapse next. I sat there beside my wife, feeling the exhaustion in each of her breaths, but I felt something else too. Relief, the relief of someone who no longer asks where they went wrong. In my mind, the next steps were already clear. No rush, no noise, just time, and the truth would do the rest. After Eleanor's words, no one managed to keep their confidence. I didn't stand up again. I stayed seated, like someone who had finished his part and was waiting for the rest to unfold on its own. There are moments when the strongest move is not to keep pressing, but to fall silent at the right time. The phone in my jacket vibrated softly. Just once. I didn't rush to check it. I knew it would vibrate again. Around me, the reception had lost its direction. Some guests checked their watches. Others pretended to chat, but their voices no longer sounded natural. Harrison Vance moved to the far side of the garden, speaking urgently with a small group. Bianca stood alone, gripping her bouquet, her face pale beneath flawless makeup. I leaned down and whispered to Eleanor that she should drink a little more water. She nodded. She didn't ask what I planned to do next. Maybe she already understood, or maybe she no longer had the strength to ask. I held my wife's hand, feeling that familiar fragility, and that feeling told me I could not hesitate. The phone vibrated a second time, longer this time. I took it out and glanced at the screen. A short message. It has started. I stood up, not to speak, but to step away from the crowd. A few eyes followed me. They didn't know that while they were still trying to preserve the dignity of a celebration, another system had already begun to move. I walked slowly, slow enough not to draw attention, steady enough to feel my heartbeat remain calm. 3 years earlier, I had started buying small pieces of the Vance family puzzle, quietly, indirectly, through names that had nothing to do with mine. I didn't do it to become richer. I did it so I would have a voice when one was needed. I stopped beneath the shade of a large oak tree, where the signal was clearer. A third message appeared, then a fourth. Cold, familiar phrases, the kind I used to read in another life. Sell orders executed. Strong market reaction. Information delivered to the right channels. I didn't reply. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. Across the garden, I saw Harrison Vance holding his phone, his face changing color. Another man rushed over and said something quickly. Harrison shook his head, then stared at the screen again. For the first time since I met him, I saw confusion without disguise. Guests began to sense that something was wrong, not because of me, but because of their own phones. Rapid notifications, interrupted calls. A few people left their tables, their voices dropping low. Bianca looked around, searching for an explanation. When her eyes met mine, I didn't turn away. I didn't smile. I simply stood there, calm. She understood something in that moment. But it was already too late to ask. Caleb hurried toward me. "What are you doing, Dad?" he asked, his voice no longer under control. "Turning off the lights," I said briefly. "In a room I didn't build." Caleb looked at me, then toward Harrison. He began to understand that whatever he had signed was no longer in his hands. Less than 10 minutes later, no one could pretend anymore. A group of major Vance shareholders gathered, faces tight. I caught words drifting through the air. Inspection files freeze. No one spoke loudly. They didn't need to. Panic spread faster than any speech ever could. Eleanor remained seated, watching it all with quiet exhaustion. I returned to her side and placed my hand on her shoulder. "We're going home soon," I said softly. She nodded, as if she had been waiting to hear that for a long time. Bianca finally approached us. Her wedding dress was no longer perfectly arranged. The bouquet lay abandoned on a chair. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I want peace," I said. "For my wife." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Not because I frightened her, but because she realized she had nothing left to bargain with. Caleb stood behind her, lost. He looked at me, then at his mother. "Dad," he said quietly, "I'm sorry." I looked at my son for a long time. I didn't see deep remorse. I saw fear of loss, and I understood that some apologies come too late to change anything. "I'm not angry," I said. "I'm just disappointed." That sentence made Caleb step back, as if he had just lost his last place to stand. The music never returned. The wedding ended not with an announcement, but with people leaving in silence. No lights, no laughter, only one bare truth remained. Power built on disregard will collapse the moment it is touched at the right point. I guided Eleanor to the car. When the door closed, I let out a long breath. Not relief, not satisfaction. Just the end of something that had to be done. Behind us, the garden lights slowly went dark. And I knew that, from that moment on, the Vance family would no longer be standing on the ground they once believed was solid. We left Austin the next morning while the city was still half asleep. There were no calls I needed to answer, and no explanations I wanted to give. I drove slowly. Eleanor sat beside me, her hands resting on her lap, her breathing steadier now. The early sunlight came through the windshield, not harsh, just enough to see the road ahead clearly. The days that followed passed quietly. I took Eleanor to a medical facility she chose herself. Not because of its reputation, but because it made her feel at ease. I respected that. The doctor said her condition would take time. It would take patience. And above all, calm. I thought I could handle that part. News about the Vance family appeared here and there, then slowly faded. I didn't follow it. I didn't need to know how they managed. I only knew this. What needed to be closed had been closed. The doors that once frightened Eleanor no longer carried any pressure, pushing her toward them. Caleb called me once. I didn't answer, not out of anger, but because I wasn't ready. Some relationships need silence, so each person can face their own share of responsibility. I trusted time to clarify that, whatever the outcome might be. A week later, I signed the final papers. The trust fund I had kept hidden for many years was transferred, piece by piece, transparent and clean. I kept none of it for myself. I didn't leave it to Caleb either. I chose a different path. I named the fund after Eleanor, not to honor her, but to remind myself why I was doing this. That fund was meant for older people who had been pushed into silence, who had been treated as burdens, who had no one willing to speak for them. I didn't expect it to change the world. I only hoped it would close the same doors I once heard them discussing in the dark. Eleanor learned about it after everything was finished. She didn't say much. She looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "That's enough," she said. I understood. For her, enough was never about money. It was about peace. We moved to a small coastal town where no one knew who we were. Every morning I made coffee. Eleanor sat on the porch watching the sea. Her hands still trembled, but her smile had returned. Not bright, just gentle, exactly the way she had always lived. Some afternoons I thought about Caleb. I wondered whether he understood what had happened. I didn't expect him to come back asking for forgiveness. I only hoped he would learn how to stand upright without leaning on anyone else. If one day he comes looking for me, I will listen. But I won't undo choices he signed with his own hands. Sometimes I hear people talk about money as a form of power. I don't disagree. I just know this. Real power is the ability to walk away without carrying hatred. It took me many years to understand that, and I didn't want Eleanor to pay any further price for my learning. In the evenings, when the sea breeze comes in, we sit together without needing many words. I tell her small stories from the day. She listens, sometimes nodding, sometimes smiling softly. Life slows down, just like the rhythm I've always carried inside. I don't see what happened as a victory. I don't see it as punishment either. To me, it was simply putting things back where they belonged. A son who chose his own path, a family that traded too much to preserve appearances, and a husband who did the only thing he could to protect the woman who walked beside him his entire life. Some people ask if I regret it. I think for a long time before answering. I don't regret staying silent for too long. I only regret not believing sooner that dignity never needs to be proven. Today I didn't lose a son. I only finished clearing away what no longer belonged to me. As the sun sets into the sea, I hold Eleanor's hand, feeling the peace we waited so long for. And this time, no one can take it away. If you stayed until this moment, thank you for listening to my story until the end. If this story made you think, please tap like to support it, subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, and share it if you believe someone out there might need to hear this. The message I want to leave is simple. Family is not a place to be measured by money or status. Those who quietly built the foundation of your life deserve respect, not to be pushed aside when they grow weak. When dignity is preserved, freedom arrives quietly, but it lasts. Thank you for giving your time to this story.